Li Shangyin, the patterned lute. No special reason, the patterned lute has 50 strings. Each string, each fret, a reminder of better times. Master Chuang awoke from his dream, bewildered butterfly. King Wan's love lives on in the cuckoo's cry. The moon shines over the great ocean, pearls weep. The sun warms Blue Mountain, jade smokes. This feeling might have lasted forever in my memory, but in the moment it was already fading away. So here we are again with Li Shangyi's poems. Let's make a brief recap in case you don't remember. So Li Shangyin is one of the gold division poets in this anthology. He has about 23, 24 poems here, which is an outstandingly high number. He is definitely considered the greatest poet of the late Tang period, which the frontiers are rather flexible. We could say it goes from 820 to 904, when the dynasty finally collapses. So let's make a brief recap also on Li Shangyin and on the late Tang period. So the late Tang period was a period of weakness. After the murder in 820 of Emperor Shenzong by a eunuch, the dynasty and the country started to go downhill. Peasant rebellion started to arise. Emperors were rather incompetent. There was a lot of infighting at the court. For example, fights against the eunuchs. For example, there was a famous incident in 835, the Sweet Yu incident, when an emperor tried to, put the eunuchs in their place, but he failed. The scholar official elite was also bickering at each other. There were big factional disputes at court between the Li and the new factions. Foreign pressure wasn't excessive, and this is probably the reason why the Tang dynasty continued to survive for at least almost 80 years. But as soon as we get to the middle years of the 9th century and later, the situation becomes worse and worse with massive peasant rebellions. And the empire, the dynasty, really comes down in the 880s when a massive rebellion, the Huangchao rebellion, destroys most of the country. This rebel leader sacks Canton and murders almost all the population, makes it to the north, takes the capitals, including Shangyin. And even though he was defeated after the Huangchao rebellion, the dynasty only remains in name, just as the Han dynasty only remained in name after the Yellow Turban rebellion. So the country is just carved up by military warlords, and after a few decades, the last puppet emperor is deposed and executed. So this is a time of hardship, of unease. Culturally and literarily, it's a time of continuation with the high Tang culture. One common stereotype that becomes felt in this period and in later periods, when analyzing this period, is that this is a Baroque age, a Baroque period. And there's this idea that in times of decline, of decadence, of hardship, literature also becomes decadent, and as a reflection of its times. And there's this idea that the late Tang poetry is generally very Baroque, very dense, very oblique, slightly pedantic even. And, it's the sort of literature that matches Western preconceptions about the metaphysical poets, perhaps in 17th century England, or Góngora and Quevedo in 17th century Spain. There's this idea of a decline, which is also a loss of classicism. In the history of art and literature, there's generally this belief in the alternation between more classical periods, where relative transparency and directness is, and the adoption of a perfect match between form and content is achieved, and as opposed to this, periods of decadence, where overtly formalist aesthetics, artificiality, obscurity become the norm and become, as it were, a kind of push, a manieristic push at making the form more complex at the time when the spirit of literature or of the classical forms has been lost. So there is perhaps a strategy of overcompensation in obscurity and rhetorical pyrotechnics and on formalist polishing and obscurity to compensate for what is the loss of sometimes of meaningful content and of a meaningful historical background. So this is a view of literary history, not necessarily correct. But I mention it because I think it illuminates perceptions of late Tang poetry and of Li Shangyin in particular. So if these are the characteristics that I mentioned that are generally assumed to affect late Tang poetry, they specifically coalesce on Li Shangyin, who is considered the best representative and the more adequate representative of these characteristics that I've mentioned. Darkness. So we've seen that classical Chinese poetry is indeterminate, is ambiguous because the language itself is ambiguous. A poem sometimes doesn't specify, because of the language, who the subject or subjects are, what is the time at which an action is taking place. In fact, this indeterminacy is taken as an aesthetically appreciable and positive thing. Ambiguity, which generates more resonances and stimulates the reader to fill in the gaps. We've also seen that most classical Chinese poetry tends to be pretty obscure and overladen with references to literary and historical figures. Now, these references wouldn't have been, for the most part, obscure for Chinese scholar officials themselves. They were part of the memorization corpus which they had to study for being able to pass the Jinshi examination, which almost all of these scholar officials passed. But all these characteristics are taken to the extreme by Li Shangyin. Li Shangyin is famous as a dark poet, and this poem is a very good exemplification of this darkness. That is, he's a poet whose images are very, very difficult to understand, whose symbols are very hermetic. He uses the compactness and succinctness of classical Chinese language to the utmost, and he includes references that would probably have been difficult to catch or even obscure for other scholar officials of his own time and place. And these will abound in the poem that we have read, which is arguably his most famous poem. So Li Shangyin has this reputation of being a poet's poet. He, along with Du Mu, are the two high poets of the late Tang period. Generally, this pairing is probably intending to mirror the higher Tang poet pairing of another Li and another Du. So we have Li Bai and Du Fu in the high Tang, and you have Li Shangyin and Du Mu in the late Tang. Now, talking a little bit about Li Shangyin, not much to say. He was a very brilliant intellectual and scholar official, but he was unlucky in his search for office. He didn't get to high positions, basically because he was caught in the middle of the two great court factions of the late Tang, the Lis and the News. He started in office under the protection and patronage of the New faction, but later he served under a member of the other faction and married a woman of the other faction. And this meant that from all practical points and purposes, in spite of having passed prestigious examinations, he only received low-ranking sinecure posts like proofreader in the palace library and things like that. So, like the career of many late Tang poets, the emphasis in Li Shangyin is on his failure to achieve success in spite of his merits. Now, having said this, I think we've explained most of the background that is needed for this poem, and we can start going into the poem itself. So let's start with the title. Many of Li Shangjing's poems do not have titles, and this poem does have a title in this translation, the Patterned Zither. I think the belief is that the Patterned Zither is the first two words with which the poem starts, and they were taken over informally as the title of the poem. What is this poem about? Again, because of its dense ambiguity, the fact that each couplet feels a bit, difficult to thread with the other couplets and with the whole narrative, it's rather difficult to say what this poem is actually about. In fact, for historical critics, there were at least, I think, 4 or 5 theories about what this poem is about, and we can comment them briefly before I give my own take, based mostly on one of the great scholar officials. Not one of the scholar officials, one of the lead translators of Chinese poetry in the 20th century, and the translator of Li Shangjing's poetry, James J.Y. Liu. So this man has a book dedicated to the poetry of Li Shangjing. That's the title. And I think he makes a very good analysis of his poetry and of this poem in particular. James J.Y. Liu also wrote The Art of Chinese Poetry, which is the book that has been the most influential in creating my own mental map of what Chinese classical poetry is, how it is supposed to be read, what are its basic metrical forms, what are its topics, and how you are supposed to interpret it. That, along with Hartmann's essay on Chinese poetry in the Indiana Companion, are my basic references for everything related to Chinese poetry. Okay, so going back to what are the topics of these poems. Well, there are different theories. So one theory is that this poem is a love poem. And the receiver or the protagonist of the love poem, which is meant to be symbolized by these patterned lute, that remains more ambiguous. It could have been his wife, it could have been some woman that he knew with the name Chinse, ornamented thither. Could be referencing a frustrated love affair with an unnamed woman, whatever. But that's one theory. The second interpretation is that the poem is actually, like some of the poems we've encountered in this anthology, it's representing music. So it's trying to represent, if you wish, 4 kinds of music played on the thither. So each of the juxtaposed and pretty independent images of the couplets are meant to reflect a mood that is evoked by the music of playing a thither. Another interpretation is that the poem is basically in memory of his deceased wife. So this is different from the first one. The first one was really some love affair with some woman. This one, his wife. And this is a poem mourning his wife. Another theory considers it very typically for late Tang poets and poems, a poem in which he laments the misfortunes of his life, his lack of success in office, and so on. And those who defend this theory would translate many of the images and symbols that appear in the poem as references to political figures and to himself. Yet another theory considers that this poem was meant to be used as an introduction to Li Shangying's collected poems and put at the beginning, and those would insist that this poem has, you could say, a meta-poetic function. It's meant to describe the power and the effectiveness of poetry itself and its effects. And I quite like this theory. James J.Y. Liu actually defends that it's a combination probably of different elements, where probably reflection about the poet's life, the passing of his wife, his lack of success in office, but also the power of literature, all coalesce, all combine in making this a poem with many meanings and with many interpretations. So, before going on then, what is this poem about? What is the topic of the poem? Again, it's open to interpretation. It's a very ambiguous poem, but basically, we could say that it works on 3 areas, on depicting the passage of time. I would say the passage of time and the dream-like nature of memory is the main topic of the poem, and sub-themes related to the passage of time and this dream-like nature of all memory, of all writing, of all thought, of all experience. Sub-themes are the ones we have just mentioned, probably lamentation for his own failures in office, lamentation for the death of his wife, perhaps, who knows, evocation of a relationship that failed, or some long lost liaison in the remote past. And there's the meta-literary reflection on the power of literature to evoke feeling, to make memories in permanent, even if memories are not real memories based on real facts. But the power of literature, to coalesce images, words into, a work of art that evokes impressions and feelings that may not have taken place or have been real in the first place. So, very complicated piece of artwork. We've been running at this for 15 minutes now, so I think I will leave the comment, the couplet by couplet comment of the poem, which, will take us time because there are many literary references packed into this 8-line poem. We will leave that for the next session, as well as a reading of 2 other translations of this poem by A.C. Graham and by James J.Y. Liu.